Hi there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is. As always, happy whatever day it is. Welcome to What's Left, the show that used to be called Left Side of the Aisle, which I suppose I'll mention for a couple of more weeks. I'm your host. My name is Larry Erickson, and for the next pushing a half an hour, I've got some stuff to talk about that I hope you'll find interesting. As always, comments, questions, and reactions can be sent to me directly. My personal email is whoviating at AOL.com, WHOVIATING. Or if you prefer, you can go to my website, which is called Lotus Surviving a Dark Time. And the URL will be here a couple of times during the show. You can leave a comment there if you like, or you can get the email address from there if you missed it. I do just ask if you send me email, as always, include something in the subject line to make it clear this is not spam, and be a little patient about getting an answer because I have a hard time getting around answering email. All right, with that out of the way, we're going to get to it. We're going to start, as we like to whenever we can, with some good news. And we're going to start with something just for the sheer fun of it. Among those who are to receive the Presidential Medal of Freedom in a ceremony on November 22nd is Vin Scully, honored for his 67-year career as a baseball announcer, which I mention here because I can still, in my head, hear him doing radio play-by-play for the Brooklyn Dodgers in the 1950s. Okay, on the more serious things. First under that category is something that actually happened a bit ago in the first week of October, but I'm bringing it up here because it's a federal regulation that goes into effect on November 28th, which means it's still time relevant here, but also because it is on a topic that I have been meaning to talk about for some time. It's one, too, that's happily getting some more deserved attention. The issue is what's called forced arbitration. Now, arbitration itself is described as an alternative means of resolving disputes between parties who want to avoid going to court over it. The idea is that the two parties present their sides of this argument to a neutral arbitrator who weighs the facts and so on and comes to a judgment to resolve the dispute. Think Judge Judy without the sneering condescension and the chosen-for-TV melodrama. Now, arbitration was initially intended for use between businesses and corporations to avoid lengthy and expensive legal battles. That is, it was a mechanism to resolve disputes between parties that were more or less equal, and one to which both parties had to freely agree. Increasingly, however, it's being used by corporations to force consumers and employees to surrender their legal rights as a condition of being able to buy a product, use a service, or get or keep a job. Increasingly, purchase agreements for things such as insurance, home building, car loans, car leases, credit cards, retirement accounts, investment accounts, computer software, and more, as well as employee contracts. They often contain provisions, usually buried in the fine print in the hopes that nobody will notice them, provisions requiring that the consumer or employee submit any dispute to binding arbitration and waive their rights to go to court or to join a class action suit. And what's more, they waive the right of appeal to appeal the decision by the arbitrator, and the arbitration occurs at a place of the corporation's choosing, using an arbitration firm which is acceptable to the corporation because it's likely to rule in their favor, which they do 93% of the time. What's more, unlike a court decision, the results are not public, so there is no public record of a dispute having arisen with the company. And consumers can even find themselves under gag orders requiring that they do not discuss the case publicly. Put simply, instead of being a tool for use between equals, arbitration as forced arbitration has become a weapon for use by the powerful against the less powerful, by the corporations against the rest of us, to keep us silenced and subservient in the face of their power. Now, if you want a particular and recent example, here's one: Wells Fargo. It's one of the nation's largest banks, and it committed systematic fraud against its customers. At least 3,500 Wells Fargo employees, at the instigation of senior management, opened approximately 1.5 million accounts and over 500,000 credit cards without the permission of the customers involved. And then the bank charged those people fees for these fraudulently opened accounts. Since 2013, customers have been trying to sue Wells Fargo, both as individuals and as class action, only to have the corporation use the forced arbitration provision in the agreement for the original legitimate account to force these people into individual private arbitration on every one of these fraudulent accounts. All right, so what's the good news in the face of all that? There is pushback. In August, the Obama administration completed a 2-year rulemaking process that declares that the federal government contractors with contracts of at least $1 million cannot impose forced arbitration on employees if the dispute arises under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act or involves claims of sexual assault or sexual harassment. That regulation is now in force. Next, the CFPB, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, is in the midst of a rulemaking procedure that would ban forced arbitration provisions from keeping people from taking part in class action suits. That is a proposed rule which has gotten widespread support. Finally, and most recently, and the thing that brought all of this up, as part of a comprehensive review of the requirements and standards that long-term care facilities must meet in order to participate in the Medicare and Medicaid programs, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid announced a rule banning forced arbitration in nursing homes that accept federal funds, which essentially all of them do. The rule was announced on October 4th. It is going into effect on November 28th. And all of that, all those regulations, that's good news. Now, this doesn't mean this won't come under the baleful glare of those surrounding the Great Orange One as they review the regulations. And, of course, he himself is even more a product of that corporate world than most of his entourage is. But forced arbitration is enormously unpopular with that portion of the general public that's aware of it, to the point that even the rump and his cronies may hesitate to so openly cross their base. All right, in any event, next up under the heading of good news is the fact that, by all appearances, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, is dead. And its equally evil cousin, the TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, which essentially is the TPP, but it's between the U.S. and the European Union, apparently that's headed for the morgue as well. On November 11th, Obama's trade office announced that it is essentially giving up on trying to pass the deal during the lame duck session after the election. Matt McAlvena, speaking for the U.S. Trade Representative, said that office has been lobbying for the TPP for months now. But he said in a statement that this is a legislative process and it's up to congressional leaders as to whether and when this moves forward. He said that after both Senate Majority Leader Fishface McConnell and House Speaker Paul Ranton have said that they will not take the matter up during the lame duck session. Since they will still be in power after the rump, who's called the TPP a disaster, is inaugurated, there's really no reason for it to come up after that either. Except maybe there is. There's no such thing as untrammeled good news these days. Because you have to realize that the big reason that all the goppers were really against this is because it was Obama's deal. I mean, if you think that they cared about the increase in corporate power that TPP entailed, the weakening of environmental and labor protections that it envisioned, the shrinking of government ability to regulate the market, PBUI, that it looked to, you are sadly deluded. They only cared about Obama not getting it passed. Already, in fact, there were rumblings about how the TPP isn't dead, it's just in purgatory. Ken Brady, he's the gopper who chairs the House Ways and Means Committee, says the TPP shouldn't be dropped, just renegotiated. So don't be surprised if in a couple of months the TPP emerges again, just with the minimum requisite number of tweaks to justify the gopper's support. So watch this space, because as the great philosopher Yogi Berra said, it ain't over till it's over. But for the moment, take a breath and recognize the fact that we can do that we can take a breath, and that's good news. Finally, for now, a case again of good news arising out of bad news. During the campaign, the Great Orange One made immigration a central issue, what with The Wall, an idea that was actually much better when it was a Pink Floyd album, swearing to deport everyone who is undocumented and pledging to undo what immigration relief the amazing Mr. O created. Now, while the rump has backtracked some on more of his audacious plans, he still claims and intend to immediately, quote-unquote, deport some 2 to 3 million undocumented persons who he claims are, quoting, criminals, gang members, drug dealers. The good news, not everyone is falling in line with the bad news. On November 14th, Charlie Beck, he's the police chief of Los Angeles, said that he has no plans to change the LAPD's stance on immigration enforcement. Since 1979, the LAPD has not stopped people just to check their immigration status. More recently, the department stopped turning over people who was arrested for low-level crimes to federal agents for deportation, and has refused to honor federal requests that they continue to detain people who have completed their prison sentence because they might be deportable. They just said, we're not going to do that unless it comes with a judge's order. Now, Police Chief Beck was backed up by Los Angeles Mayor Eric Garcetti, who said that, quoting, our law enforcement officers and LAPD don't go around asking people for their papers, nor should they. That's not the role of local law enforcement. Now, this is not a new policy for the LAPD again, but to say it now and to say it so clearly at a time of renewed fear running through the immigrant community in this country, at a time when there are rumblings of plans to force local police departments to become the immigration police, to say it now is a welcome sign of solidarity. And although it is only, again, the bad news that makes this necessary, it's still good news to hear it. And that's true because such solidarity is more necessary now than ever. Since the rump's victory, there have been numerous racist, sexist, xenophobic, and homophobic incidents, with bigoted supporters celebrating the success of the Great Orange One by spewing their bilge over any convenient target. The Southern Poverty Law Center, which tracks these things, counted more than 200 hate crimes involving vandalism, threats, and intimidation in just the 5 days following the election. And don't expect this to get better. Kansas Secretary of State Chris Kobach has joined the rump's transition team. Now, who is Chris Kobach? Well, actually, I can tell you a lot of stuff about Chris Kobach, but we're going to limit ourselves for now to this. Remember the infamous Arizona law, SB 1070, the one that was known as Your Papers, Please law? Remember that? He wrote it. Remember the 24 copycat bills that appeared around the country? He wrote those too. Remember the rump's plan for a registry of all Muslims in the United States? That was Kobach's idea. And remember how the rump proposed, and may still propose, barring immigrants from sending money to their families in Mexico as a means to force Mexico to pay for the Great Wall of Orange? Yeah, Kobach. And now he is on the rump's transition team, right there alongside so-called Chief Strategist and Senior Counselor Steve Bannon, until now Executive Chairman of the overtly anti-Semitic, misogynist, and racist Breitbart News. A need for solidarity indeed. So here's a simple way you can show it. Wear a safety pin. The idea originally came from a woman named Allison, who kept her last name private. She's an American living in the United Kingdom, and in the wake of the Brexit vote, she was upset by the surge in xenophobic incidents. And in some ways, she was even more upset by the realization that even though she's a foreigner, because she's white and English is her first language, the anger against foreigners did not include her. So she came up with the idea of wearing a safety pin as a means of saying, "You are safe with me. I support your right to be here." The idea caught on. In fact, back in July, I gave her a Hero Award for coming up with the idea. Now the idea is spreading to the United States. I mean, it's a small thing. It's just a symbol, but the fact is symbols can have power. So why not do it? It'll cost you nothing. And yes, I suppose you can make all kinds of arguments about how we won't accomplish anything. It's just silly, blah, blah, blah. But do it anyway. Just remember, this is not a substitute for other actions. It's a call for it. And it's time for us to take a break. And we're back. And since we're just talking about work to be done, let's continue along that line. Last week I mentioned and celebrated the spontaneous demonstrations against the rump and his declared positions that broke out in the wake of the election. That's what we need, I said. Those protests, I almost said to my great delight, but what I really mean is to my great encouragement, have continued. Thousands upon thousands of people, many of them, but by no means all young, in dozens of cities across the country have turned out into the streets in protests that, as I do the show, have continued for more than a week. Now, it's hard to maintain that kind of day in and day out passion, and the demonstrations appear to be tapering off some. But that doesn't mean the end of the opposition. It doesn't mean the end of the resistance. For one thing, there are still rallies and demonstrations planned, and they're ongoing. In fact, a list I checked the night before I did the show had some 51 events in 44 places scheduled to occur between November 16th and November 20th. There are counter-inaugurals planned for both Washington, D.C. and Los Angeles on January 20th, and a women's march on Washington on January 21st, with support rallies in Oakland, California, Portland, Oregon, and Austin, Texas. Even beyond that, there's a lot of talk about settling in for the long haul. For not so much what we might call furious passion as sustained passion. A passion that can and will turn people out into the streets, but doesn't expect that to happen every day of every week for weeks and months on end. One aspect of that long haul could be seen on November 15th, when students on campuses around the country walked out of class in protest to pressure school officials to make each of their respective schools a sanctuary campus, one that limits cooperation with federal immigration authorities. Organizers have said that 80 campuses saw such action, and the response to that day from the administrations of those schools was mixed and not all positive, but then again, that's exactly what you should expect in the face of a new movement, one that, precisely because it is an on-campus movement, is one in a position to generate slow and sustained pressure, and we're going to need a lot of that. But we have to recognize that as far as the establishment, in this case I mean the political and media establishment, that as far as that establishment is concerned, this is just not how you do things. Demonstrations, protests, and the like, well, they can make interesting visuals for TV, but as serious parts of a movement for change? What? Don't be silly. Demonstrations are disruptive, they're rude, they're messy. They're impolite towards power. That's just not how we do things around here. So we shouldn't be surprised by two trends. One is to diss the protests and dismiss the protests and the protesters, especially by a sort of mocking condescension of how either unrealistic or naive they are. Here's a real example of that. The Washington Post did a story about the protests, and this is how it started. This is the first 3 graphs of the story in full. Quoting, "They're angry, they're afraid, they're upset that Donald Trump is going to be their next president. But many of the protesters who took to the street in cities across the country over the past week didn't cast a ballot for the candidate who could have beaten him. Instead of voting for Hillary Clinton, the Democratic nominee, dozens of protesters in cities from Philadelphia to Portland, Oregon, said in interviews this week that they had cast ballots for the Green Party candidate Jill Stein, wrote in Senator Bernie Sanders, or in some instances didn't vote at all." Because, well, I mean, how could you possibly protest the rump if you didn't vote for Hillary? I mean, that's just not the way things are done. By the way, after dissing the protesters, the Post piece admitted in a parenthesis that Clinton had actually won most of the states where the largest demonstrations occurred, despite what the Post tried so hard to portray as the political naivete of protesters. And the thing is, we have to expect that kind of attitude. We have to expect it always meets protest movements. And our best response, both short-term and long-term, is to just keep on keeping on, to do what we would have done anyway. The other trend, though, is more subtle and potentially more damaging, more dangerous to our society. It is the tendency, even the desire, for the establishment, and again here I'm talking about the political and media establishment, it is the desire for that establishment to normalize whatever happens, to make it ordinary, to make it seem whatever happens within that establishment, to make it seem like nothing has really happened, nothing has really changed, everything is just as it was. Now they are trying to normalize the idea of the rump administration. One example of that, the Democrats are gearing up for a strategy not of opposition to the rump, but one of working with him where he has said some not so insane things, such as wanting to increase spending on infrastructure. Oh, no, you see, there's nothing that outrageous. I mean, we do have some policy differences, certainly, but see, we can still work together. Another example, at a first formal talk since the election, Hillary Clinton, without referring to the rump specifically, still said, quote, "There is common ground to build upon," unquote. And a third, maybe even better example, CBS's Leslie Stahl said after an interview with the rump that he is more subdued, more serious. The message from that establishment is, you see, it'll all work out. It'll all be fine. Nothing's really changed. It'll all be fine. With, of course, the unspoken addendum for us. We can't let that normalization happen, and I guarantee you it will if we don't stop it. In fact, here's another aspect of that normalization, and it shows how progressives are stuck fighting a sort of two-front war. One against the reactionary policies and convictions of the Great Orange One, and the other against the liberal political establishment represented by the Democrat Party and a significant number of the people who falsely claimed the honored title of progressive. Specifically, I am talking about the attempts by that establishment to avoid any blame for their failures in this election. Even more specifically about the, quote, reasons, unquote, that Clinton lost. There have been 4 main reasons, major reasons, announced why Clinton lost. 4 main arguments. 1, blame third parties. 2, blame sexism. 3, blame Russia. 4, blame James Comey. Now, what do all those have in common? They mean you don't have to look at your own candidate, at her flaws and failings, at her baggage. And you don't have to look at the failings of your own campaign. You don't have to look at the fact that despite all the talk about how it was the white vote that put the rump over the top, Clinton did just about as well with white people as Obama did in 2012. What she did, however, do was 7 points worse than he did with blacks, which is a deficit amplified by the fact that black turnout was down, so she got a smaller percentage of a smaller number. She also did 8 points worth with Latinos, 11 points worse with Asians, and 5 points worse among young voters than Obama did 4 years previously. blame third parties, blame sexism, blame whatever you can think of, and you don't have to consider that. The point of all these excuses, that is to insist that you did nothing wrong. To insist that all you need to do is sharpen your message. To insist at the end of the day there is no need for any change. That notion, as we know, is wrong, just as all those reasons is wrong. Or they're factually wrong, or they're deeply flawed. But unfortunately, I'm running out of time here, so I'm going to have to put off what's wrong with those arguments until the next show, which I promise you will be the last one where I will be post-morteming, if there is such a word, post-morteming the elections. But the thing is, I do have about 4 minutes left, and there are a couple things I want to get to. Two things. One, is just something I want to note for the record. I won't blame you if you don't remember the name Philando Castile. His was one of the too many names of young black men wrongfully killed by police. On July 9th, Philando Castile was pulled over by a cop named Geronimo Yanez in St. Anthony, Minnesota, a part of Minneapolis. It was 9:05 p.m. By 9:06 p.m., Castile was bleeding to death from being shot multiple times as his girlfriend and her 4-year-old daughter watched. On November 15th, Ramsey County Attorney John Choi announced that Yanez will be charged with 3 felonies, 1 count of second-degree manslaughter and 2 counts of dangerous discharge of a firearm, declaring that, quote, no reasonable officer, knowing, seeing, and hearing what Officer Yanez did at the time, would have used deadly force under those circumstances, unquote. Now, a charge, as we have seen too often in such cases, is a long way from holding a cop responsible for wrongfully and needlessly killing someone. But at least it is a first step. Finally, for this week, we have an RIP. A musical career of singing and songwriting that has lasted 50 years has come to an end. Leonard Cohen has died at the age of 82 at his home in Los Angeles. Now, even though his song Hallelujah wound up being described as some kind of latter-day secular hymn, and it was probably his best known and most covered work, I have to say myself that my personal favorite was and remains Suzanne. And actually, I can still enjoy putting on a harmony to the Judy Collins version of that song, even though she changes some of the words, as she often does in songs for some reason. But no matter. It is another chapter closed, but as with any other artist, the art lives on. So R.I.P. Leonard Cohen. That's it for this week. Just as a reminder, next week is Thanksgiving week. It is also the last full week in November, so we will not be doing a show next week. We take the last week off, last week of the month off. So we will see you in 2 weeks for the show for the week of December 1st to December 7th. And I swear we're going to get away from talking about the election all the time. All right, so, but for now, you just have the best 2 weeks you possibly can. And as always, I wish you peace.